this is Roger, thanks for dropping by. It's kitchen time. There won't be many kitchen times now till early spring, but this is a new plant. I want it mounted, so there'd be no point in waiting till that time of year to do it, because what would I do with it in the meantime? So I just as well get on and mount it. Yes, I've done many mounting videos before, but like with everybody that's got a channel that runs along for a length of time, you get new people come in. You can't expect people to go back and watch every video you've ever made. It'll take about a year. So obviously people drop in and they may drop out again, but you know, things that you do, examples of work that you do and things like that can be lost to new people because they're not going to go back through all your old videos. So repeating yourself sometimes is not that. It's not repeating, it's actually for some people the first time they've seen you do something. So, you know, it's worth a bit of repetition now and again. For those of you who've seen me mount plenty of plants in the past, you don't probably need to watch this. You've seen it many times before. But nonetheless, it's a new plant, it needs doing. And before I start, boy is this plant stirred up a hornet's nest. It is emphatically Dendrobium aphyllum. Why do I say emphatically? There's been some confusion with this plant, not this exact one, but you know, this particular type of Dendrobium over the years, going back into the 1800s. Obviously in the 1800s, lots of plants were being discovered. Some are still being discovered, so it's not necessarily an old thing, but the huge bulk were found, you know, in those first 50 to 100 years, shall we say. Yeah, it's still going on, they're still finding new species. But this one goes back into the 1800s, and there's been some confusion because you've got three names here. You've got Prezzie, and you've got cucullatum, and you've got aphyllum. And if you actually look at the plants and the blooms, they do all look incredibly similar, so I can understand the confusion. But with all this renaming, you know, going on, some bright sparks about 15 years ago, so not that long ago, they came along and emphatically stated that Prezzie, which is a synonym for cucullatum, was not the same species as aphyllum, and therefore they are different species. And then everybody tore up their old labels and put new ones on and things like that, as you do. And then Kew Gardens came along with their ability to get right down to genetic DNA, actually turned the whole thing on its head and actually said that Prezzie and cucullatum and aphyllum are effectively the same thing, and the correct name now is aphyllum. Yeah, the confusion with Prezzie and cucullatum was discovering at different times effectively what was the same plant but not knowing it. I mean, you have to think back in the 1800s, if somebody in France discovered something and somebody in the UK discovered something, how would they know each other have found the same plant? You know, the communications weren't there, the internet wasn't there, you know, so you can understand how these things happened. But effectively, this is emphatically called aphyllum according to Kew Gardens, and that's how it is. So that's what it's going on the tag. And there you go, Rose, the first one of the new tags done. And that will be a regime from now on. Okay, I want this one mounted, and I want it to stay on this mount, well, until the mount falls apart, basically. So this is like a permanent home for this plant. I've got a decision to make now. Because this is a kiki, but is a very large kiki, so it's not a little short thing that's only just been taken off the plant and needs to be grown on. This one's big enough to be treated as an adult plant. Yeah? So I've got a decision to make. Should I try and keep this one growing and try and get some new growths to push out? Or looking at it, the fact that it's got some yellowing leaves, I would say that this plant has already decided to go into its rest period. It's not fully there yet because it's still got green leaves. This is a true deciduous type. It grows new canes from early in the year, throughout the year, into the autumn period, and then as it goes into its rest period, through the winter, it dumps its leaves. So its leaves don't stay on the plant. Yeah, not like some do. This one drops its leaves each year from the new growths. So towards the end of the winter, you've got a mountful of bare stalks. Not the most attractive thing, but then you get the blooms, providing you've treated it properly. So it's going to live on this mount for its life, basically, until the mount falls apart. This is a good, strong piece of bark. Yeah, I don't see that falling apart in any hurry. It's a lovely gnarly piece. It's been used before, so the hook's already on it, but that is nothing more than a hole through there and a loop of bonsai wire. My bonsai wire is quite soft, I can bend it easily. And quite honestly, that's why I like to use it. I don't have to get pliers out and muck about with brute strength or anything. It's a pliable wire. So that's what I use. You know, there is a little bit of movement in that hook, but it's going to hang. It doesn't matter. I'm quite happy with that. If you want to do it properly and make it absolutely rigid, you're better off going with 2 holes and put the wire in through the back, up through there, out through that hole like that, and use steel wire that once it's put in place will never move again. Yeah? And always, if you're going to use wire, use something that can never rust. Yeah, rust does not do the roots of plants any good at all. So never use like a bare wire that's going to get rusty because it's going to get wet. This is a coated aluminium based wire, so that can't rust. And if you use the galvanized steel type wire, that also can't rust. So certain types of wire are not suitable. Right, so let's have a chat about the history of the plant. The history of this plant is it's travelled from Italy to me, from my friend Alberto, as a gift. Thank you very much. And it made it okay. Hopefully it didn't get too cold on its journey. Now, I use this moss. It's a premium grade New Zealand moss. Sterile, dried right out. Effectively an inert media, but it is still organic. Yeah, but it is inert. There shouldn't be anything living in there. And there won't be anything living in or around that, because that's just had boiling water poured over it in copious amounts, left to soak, and then repeated. Yeah, and then rinsed off to cool it down, because you don't want to put your roots on a boiling hot piece of bark. So this is going to get a minute amount of moss behind the roots, because that moss will have to stay there, and eventually it will break down. But if there isn't much of it, it won't matter. And I might even be able to tease it out with a pair of tweezers or a pair of pliers. But I just want a little bit to back up these roots, but certainly not much. Literally a couple of crevices, yeah. And actually I've just decided I've put that in the wrong place, because this plant is going to grow downwards. So I want it at the top of the mount, not at the bottom. The reason being that the distance from the roof, sorry about that helicopter, he's training, so he just keeps coming round and round. Beginning to get on one's threepneys, I think is the expression, because it just keeps on and on this morning. But people got to learn, I suppose, if they're going to fly the flipping things. It's better that they know what they're doing. Yeah, so I need the plant at the top. As the new growths come out, they will gain weight and arch over. It naturally is a pendulous plant. Now the way these roots are, I've got choices. If I put it that way round, yeah, the cane will come out from the mount and look quite nice, but it will then curl round at the moment. This cane, because it has got a natural bend in it, will go round behind the mount. If I put the roots that way round, yeah, the base will be on the mount. I'm actually going to tuck it in that crevice so that I can tie it on nicely, and the plant will arch away from there. But by putting it that way round, I will get a lot more roots in contact with the bark, which at the moment is what I want. I'm going to spread these out as I tie it to encompass a fair bit of this mount, and spread these out so that they're nice and flat and tucked into crevices where I can, and just placed around the mount. So that's the goal, is to get it on there like that and get it on there firm. And I will put a little bit of moss on top of those roots. The idea being now, when I mount something, is that at some point in time, if I want to take the moss off and it's sat on top of the roots, all I've got to do is take the ties off and just hook it off. However, if I've got loads and loads of moss underneath the roots, yeah, and I want to get that moss off, it turns into a big deal. You know, it's virtually an unmount and a remount. And once your roots get attached to a mount, unmounting it will do damage. You can limit it by lots of soaking, but you will damage some roots and you will leave some nice live root tips behind on the mount. They will break off. It's very difficult to get every root off. So the idea is to put some moss on the outside so that I can hydrate this. Let's get a tie on first, it saves struggling. I used to always put the moss on first and then try and tie it, and half the moss falls off, and then there's some language. And you know, I don't need to do it that way. If I give the plant a turn first and hold it in place, then I can go back and put some moss on. I use quite a light gauge fishing line. Now if you use fishing line, use it with extreme caution. It is very fine and incredibly strong. If you pull it too tight, you will garrot your roots. Worse still, the stem of the plant, if you're tying the stem of the plant on. So it doesn't need to be a garrot, it just needs to hold the plant in place. There's no need to pull it really, really tight. If I get a really large, heavy plant, then I use a fine wire to hold it on, simply because it's thicker than fishing line, and I can pull it a bit tighter without doing damage. But this fishing line will cut in if you're not careful. Now I just use a simple slip knot for my first loop, and I always have a good end hanging out because I need that end in a minute to tie. And if it's really short and squitty, it's incredibly difficult to grab hold of it and tie it, because this stuff's, you know, very fine. So the first loop goes round just to hold the flipping thing in place so that I can let go with one hand. And I always put my knot round the back. As it's a slip knot, it will just pull until it gets to the point where it starts to bite. And that's as tight as it needs to be. Yeah, I'll go round once more. Now that's got the plant. Now I can let go. And now I can put a little bit more moss, not a lot, in some places. I still want some of these roots bare. The reason I want them bare is the decision that this is going into a, I'll call it a semi-rest, because I don't want it to totally dehydrate, because it's changed its environment and everything else. So I want some moss to hold a bit of moisture, but I don't want the whole root ball covered in a huge amount of moss that will stay soaking wet for days and days. So just a thin layer will allow it to dry fast. And then I'll leave some roots bare. If you're using fishing line, it does pay to dry your hands. And then I've got a lovely nook in the bark there, so by coming down to that point and creeping upwards from that point, I've got something to bite on, and a loop that cannot get loose because it's in that nook. And I'll just go round as many times as I think I need to hold that moss in place. You can see it's not pulling tight, it's just enough to pinch gently onto that moss, not cut right through it and garrot the roots. That's it. That's the only number of turns I need, and because it's now firmly held, I can turn it over. My little trick with the slip knot is, from the knot to where I go round leaves a V shape. Now this loose end here, if I tuck it into that V, and then talk about it while I get the end out, because it always manages to get hooked up, but I just need that end. Now you can see that loose end has got something to pull against. It's the original knot, otherwise it's all loose and floppy and has got nowhere to grip onto. Now I've got a place where I can tie a proper knot, So I always use a reef knot, which is right over left, left over right. Well, you can do it the other way around if you're left-handed, but I'm right-handed, so right over left, left over right. And that knot will pull nice and tight. I've still got loose ends. They're going to come in handy now, because I can tie my tag on. Because quite honestly, if I didn't put a tag on this plant, I would probably get a hit squad. Men would be sent to remind me to use my tags. So I'm just going to loop that in there so it's got something to hold on to, and then just put my loose end through the hole I've already made. And then because I've got two nice long ends, again, just a simple right over left, left over right to hold the tag in place. Job done. A reminder again, especially of those of us who have children and or pets, don't leave silly little bits of fishing line lying around, especially if they get on the floor. Cats like to play with things, and the last thing you want is a pussycat with a bit of that stuck down their throat, or a child, or a dog, or whatever. So make sure you dispose of your loose ends, count them, and count them as you make them, and count them as you put them in the bin, and you know you haven't missed any. Okay, so that's that one done. Yeah, I mean that's nicely held in place, and any new growths that come out can just hang down with this. I wouldn't mind putting a tie around there, but because it's going to wobble. Is it going to knock itself around? I think I will. It's not something I would normally do, but I just want that plant to hold still. It's whether you're mounting a plant or putting a plant in a pot, it's quite important to make sure it's firm and doesn't wobble. Some say that a wobbling plant will actually stimulate root growth. I personally have never seen that. I've seen plants that are held firm take off an awful lot quicker than ones that are wobbled. So like in pots where you don't stake and there's a bit of movement, I find that the roots take off an awful lot quicker if you've got a nice firm plant. Be it on a mount or in a pot, it needs to be firm and still, and then it will just get going better. Well, in my experience, that's what happens. So, trouble is, in this light, I can't actually see this fishing line. It disappears from sight. It's so fine and virtually clear. Now, all this is supposed to do is just hold the stem of that plant gently against the bark and stop it wobbling. That's all that loop's for. It's just to stop it wiggling around in the wind, or wiggling around when I'm moving around. Am I pulling the right one here? That's the trouble with a slip knot. If you pull the wrong one, you end up with nothing, and I am pulling the wrong one. So grab the other one and pull. That's better. That's better. Right, there we go then. That'll just hold that stem nice and firm. Same again, because I started with a slip knot, I've got a natural V from that loop. That's why I went round again. It gives me something to bite onto. So I can get the end to go through and manage to pick it up. There we go. See, it just grabs hold of where the knot is, and then you've got a place to tie. Otherwise you're tying in the air. Again, simple reef knot. Reef knots don't slip. If you do right over left, you'll look round and it's come undone. Whereas if you do it the other way round, it seems to bite on better. That's 4 loose ends I've got to put in the bin now. 2 lots of 2. So there we go, that's it, mounted. Yeah, and as I said, this is going to get a semi-rest. You can see already that these roots have hydrated. They've gone green simply from the amount of moisture that was in that moss. Yeah, now that's not going to get any more water until that's totally dry. And this starts going crispy, and these have gone back to white. Yeah, but at the moment those roots have hydrated simply by having some moss near them. Yeah, well, obviously the bark's wet as well. So there we go, Dendrobium aphyllum, and Thank you, Alberto, and let's hope it does well. It'll depend next year how well it takes off, basically. It could push out quite a few new growths in its first year. There might only be one, and it'll have to wait to actually get its strength, because it is, after all, a kiki, albeit a very large one. So there we go, quick mount, new tag, and that can now go and hang up with the other long cane Dendrobiums and get a similar treatment. So thanks for dropping by, see you next time.